The Telltale Heart. Nervous. I had been terribly nervous and still am. But why did they say I am mad? The disease had made my senses sharp. My hearing was extremely sharp. I heard everything in the world. I heard many things under the ground, so could I be mad? Listen, see how calm I am? Let me tell you the story. I do not know when I first had the idea. When I did, it worried me day and night. I had no reason to dislike the old man. I loved him. He had never hurt me. I did not want his gold. I think it was his cruel eye. Yes, it was the film across his light blue eye. When he looked at me, my blood ran cold with fear. At last I decided to murder the old man. I would be free of that eye forever. You think I am mad. Madmen know nothing. A madman could never have been so clever, or so careful. You should have seen how carefully I planned his death. I pretended to be very kind to the old man. Every night at midnight, I silently opened his bedroom door. When the opening was wide enough, I placed a flashlight in the room. At first, I did not turn the flashlight on, and no light showed. I watched the old man through the opening in the door for an hour. How clever I was not to wake him. When I could see him on the bed, I turned on the flashlight. I shined the weak light on the eye. I did this for a week. Every night the eye was shut. It was not the old man that troubled me, it was his cruel eye. While it was shut, I had no wish to kill him. Every morning I asked him if he had slept well. It would take a very clever old man to know he was being watched each night. On the 8th night, I opened the door with particular care. I had never felt so strong, or believed as much that my plan would be successful. I laughed quietly to myself. The old man had no idea what I was doing. He moved suddenly in bed. It was completely dark. He could not see me slowly opening the door. My thumb knocked the clasp on the flashlight. The old man cried out, "Who's there?" I did not reply. I knew he was listening for the sounds that frighten us at night. I have done this many times myself. After a while, I heard him groan in alarm. I knew how frightened he felt. I felt sorry for him. He was sitting up, trying to remain calm, but his fear was increasing. He sensed me in the room. He sensed his approaching death. I turned on the flashlight carefully. The old man did not see me or hear me. A narrow stream of light shined on his wide-open eye. I grew angry as I looked at the horrible film that covered the eye. As I said before, I am not mad. It is just that my senses are extremely sharp. Just then I heard a deep, soft sound, like a ticking watch. It was the beating of the old man's heart. The sound of his heart beating made me angrier. I kept very still. I shined the light on the eye. The terrible beating of his heart grew louder every minute. The old man must have been terrified. Remember, I told you I was nervous. I still am. In the middle of the night, the strange beating of the old man's heart made me lose control. The beating continued to grow louder. What if the heart burst? A new fear struck me. What if a neighbor heard the beating? The awful noise had to be stopped. The old man had to die. With a loud shout, I turned on the light. I ran into the room. The old man screamed. I threw him to the floor and pulled the heavy bed over him. I laughed. For a few minutes, the heart kept beating. I became calm. The sound would not be heard through the wall. At last, the beating stopped. I examined the body. The heart was still. He was dead. That cruel eye would never look at me again. You will not think I am mad when I tell you how I hid the old man. I worked quickly and quietly. I cut the head, arms, and legs off the body. I placed the head and body parts under the wooden floorboards. Not even his horrible eye could have noticed anything wrong. There were no marks. I was too clever to leave any drops of blood. It was nearly morning when I finished. There was a knock at the door. I felt quite confident. What could frighten me now? 3 policemen politely introduced themselves. A neighbor had heard a scream during the night. I explained that I had screamed during a bad dream. I invited the policemen to search the house. They examined the old man's bedroom but found nothing. I asked the police to sit and rest. I was sure my clever crime would never be discovered. I even placed my chair exactly over the body under the floor. The police were satisfied. I was calm. As I sat with the policeman, I developed a headache and began to feel ill. I heard a ringing sound in my ears. The policemen still sat and talked. They appeared undisturbed by the ringing noise. The ringing increased. I talked quickly to shut out the noise. The noise became louder. I realized it was not in my ears. My face became white with fear. I talked faster and faster, but the noise grew even louder. It was a deep, soft sound like a ticking watch. I spoke more quickly and urgently as I tried to cover the noise. Why would the police not leave? I walked backward and forward. I waved my arms. The noise was becoming louder and louder. What could I do? I shouted wildly. I hit the floor with my chair, but the noise still grew louder. The policeman smiled and talked. Was it possible? Oh no, they knew I was guilty. They were laughing at my terror. It was cruel. I felt I was going to die. Listen! Louder, louder, louder! Rogues! I shouted. Stop pretending! I did it! Pull up the floor. Look under here. It is the beating of his horrible heart. The Premature Burial. Chapter 1. Buried Alive. There are certain subjects that are extremely interesting, but they are too horrible to write about. The writer of fiction must avoid these subjects, or he will horrify people. We can only accept these stories if they are true. We show a sick interest in the horror of these true stories. Consider the Black Death of London. Think about the burial of prisoners in the Black Hole of Calcutta. We are excited because the events actually happened. As fiction, we would find them horrible. We are often more interested in the size of the accident than the accident itself. Sometimes one person suffers more during an individual misfortune than a whole crowd does in a public accident. For this, let us give thanks to a kind God. It is bad enough if only one person has an accident, but it is worse if the accident happens to a whole crowd. To be buried alive is the most terrifying experience that could happen to anyone. Intelligent people know that it has often happened. We are not always sure if people are dead or alive. The body is a mystery. We know there are diseases that make body parts suddenly stop working. After a while, for some reason that is not clear, the body starts to work again. The person is not dead. However, the mystery remains. Where was the spirit during this pause in life? Premature burials certainly do happen. We have been told this by doctors and people who have suffered this horror. Some of you might remember a very interesting case a short time ago. It happened in a city near here. It caused a great deal of public discussion. The wife of a famous lawyer suddenly became ill. The strange illness worried her doctors. After much suffering, she appeared to die. There was no reason to think she was still alive. She looked like a dead person. Her face became narrow. Her lips were white. She was cold. Her heart was not beating. After 3 days, her body had become hard. She was buried quickly before death could cause her body to break down. The doctors expected the usual changes after death to happen. 3 years later, the husband opened the family burial vault. He pushed the heavy door wide open. He stepped into the vault. What a horrible fright he got. A white object fell into his arms. It was the bones of his wife. The burial cloth around her bones was no longer tied. The cloth was torn. A careful investigation showed that she had become conscious 2 days after her burial. Her movements inside the burial box caused it to fall from where it had been placed. The box broke apart. She was able to free herself. A large piece of the broken box lay on the steps. She had been using this to strike the thick door of the vault. Nobody heard her knocking. Nobody heard her terrified shouting. She became unconscious and died. When she fell, her burial cloth became caught. She remained in a standing position. Eventually, all that remained of her body was a bundle of bones. In 1810, a live burial happened in France. It was a very strange matter. She was a beautiful girl from a good family called Victorine Lafourcade, and was loved by a poor Frenchman named Julien Boussuet. He was a journalist for a newspaper. Victorine really loved Julien. However, because he was poor, she decided not to marry him. Instead, she married Monsieur Renel. He was rich and worked in a bank. Monsieur Renel was cruel to Victorine. After a few unhappy years of marriage, she died. She was buried in a grave in her home village. Julien Boussuet was alone and sad. He had never forgotten his deep love for Victorine. He went to the village, planning to cut off a lock of her hair. He reached the grave at midnight. He quietly dug up the body. As he was cutting the hair, Victorine suddenly opened her eyes, waking from her unconscious state. She had been buried alive. Julien kissed her. He carried her quickly to his home. He gave her some very strong medicine. She became more alert and felt her love for Julien's return. Slowly, her health returned. Once more, she loved Boussuet, and this time she wanted to stay with him. She did not let her husband know she was alive. She ran away to America with Julien. 20 years later, Julien Boussuet and Victorine returned to France. She thought no one would remember her. However, Monsieur Renel, her husband, saw and remembered her. He stated Victorine was still his wife. She said she was not. The court agreed with Victorine. The judge said that Renel and Victorine were no longer married. Julien and Victorine lived together happily until they were old. A local magazine recorded a very interesting case. A strong, healthy soldier was thrown from his horse and knocked unconscious. He had injured his head, but it did not seem to be serious. All the usual medical help was given. Liquid was taken from his head. This was done to prevent damage to the brain. However, he sunk deeper into unconsciousness. Finally, he appeared to die. The weather was warm, so he was quickly buried in a public cemetery. 2 days later, a cemetery worker was sitting on the soldier's grave. He felt the earth shake under him. He said, "It felt as if someone was moving below." A crowd of visitors was in the cemetery. Nobody believed the worker, but his terrified shouting finally made the crowd believe him. They rushed to start digging. It only took a few minutes to open the shallow grave. The soldier looked dead, but he was sitting up in the box in which he was buried. His violent movements had lifted the top. He was immediately taken to the nearest hospital. He had some difficulty breathing, but he was alive. After a few hours, he felt better. He spoke to everyone. It is a very interesting story. Chapter 2. The Autopsy and Catalepsy. This was the soldier's story. He had been terrified. He remained conscious for about an hour after he was buried. He heard the crowd moving above him and shouted for help. He knocked on the lid of the burial box. Then he became unconscious. The cemetery workers had covered the grave in a hurry. They had used a very thin layer of dirt to cover the box. Enough fresh air was able to reach the soldier. He became conscious again after hearing the noise of the crowd. Once awake, he was horrified to find himself still buried alive. Sometime later, the soldier was almost well again. As part of a medical test, he was shocked with an electric charge. It was not successful. After all he had been through, the soldier died from the electric shock. In another instance, an electric shock saved a man's life. There was huge public interest in the case. An Englishman had been buried for 2 days. It appeared that he had been ill and died suddenly of a fever. The doctors were puzzled about the unusual course of his disease. They asked if they could do an autopsy. His friends objected to the idea, so the doctors decided to do the autopsy secretly. They paid some London grave robbers to dig up the body. The Englishman had been buried in a deep grave. 3 nights later, the body was taken to a hospital. The autopsy began. A large cut was made in the stomach. The doctors were surprised. The body looked fresh and healthy inside. They decided to try an electric shock. The shock was repeated several times. Each time, the charge produced the usual muscle movement, but no other result. However, once or twice during the movements, the man almost seemed to be alive. It was almost morning. The doctors wanted to hurry and complete the secret autopsy. A medical student had another idea. He made another cut in the body. He gave an electric shock directly to the heart. Immediately, the patient became conscious. He stepped off the autopsy table. He looked about anxiously and spoke. No one understood what he said. Then he fell unconscious to the floor. For a moment, everyone stood still in surprise. They could see he was alive. The doctors gave him some medicinal gas, and the man became fully conscious. Slowly, he recovered. His friends were delighted. They were amazed to see him again. He said nothing to anyone about what had happened. He wanted to be quite sure he had completely recovered. The most exciting part of the case is what he said later. He stated that at no time was he completely unconscious. He was confused, but he was aware of everything that happened to him. In the autopsy room, he tried to say, "I am alive." These stories show us that premature burials do happen. But how often are they discovered? There is seldom any reason to dig up a grave. There could be nothing more terrifying than being buried alive. The heavy weight on the chest, the strong gases from the wet earth, the thick cotton burial cloths, the narrow box, the dark night, the hunger of the hidden worms, the complete silence. These are the horrors of the grave. What about the beautiful world above? Imagine knowing your friends would rescue you from early burial while also knowing that contact with them was impossible. The terrible feeling that you might as well really be dead. Premature burial is the most awful horror on earth. There could be nothing worse than being buried alive. All these stories of premature burial are extremely interesting, but do people really believe such unusual stories? The following experience might satisfy some doubts. I will share my own true story with you. For several years, I had been suffering a rare illness. The doctors called it catalepsy. The causes are unknown, but the doctors understand what happens to the patient. The person lies unconscious. He is warm. There is a little color in the face. The breathing is shallow and rough. The beating of his heart is weak. Patients suffer to different degrees. Sometimes the catalepsy lasts a day or less. Sometimes it lasts weeks or months. Medical tests fail to tell if the person is dead or alive. Usually, the person is saved from premature burial by his friends. They know he has a history of catalepsy. The disease starts slowly. This is lucky for the sufferer. If it started quickly, more people would be buried alive. It is not so lucky for the person whose first attack is sudden and serious. It is certain that he would be buried prematurely. My own illness was exactly the same as described in medical books. In some attacks, I became sleepy. Then suddenly I would be quite normal again. At other times, it happened quickly. I became unconscious immediately. I would stay in this silent condition for weeks. Then, very slowly, my senses would return. Except for the catalepsy, my normal health was good. However, the catalepsy did affect my waking from sleep. I could never wake up with a clear head. For some time, I remained confused. My memory was completely absent. There was no physical pain in my illness, but words cannot describe how my mind suffered. I became haunted by thoughts of death. Day and night, I worried about premature burial. At night, I shook with fear. It was difficult to let myself go to sleep. I was terrified that I would wake up in a grave. When I did sleep, the same dream of burial repeated itself again and again. Chapter 3. The Dream. This was the dream. I dreamed I was in a cataleptic state. Suddenly a voice called, "Stand up." It was dark. I did not know where I was. I could not see the person who had spoken. Then a cold hand held me. Again the voice said, "Stand up." "Who are you?" I asked. "I have no name," said the voice. "I was a cruel human. Now I am an unhappy spirit. Feel how I shake. Yet I am not cold. It is this horrible state I am in. I envy your peaceful sleep. Come out into the night. I will show you these unhappy graves. Look, is that not a sad sight?" I looked, and all the graves had been opened. I could see the bodies wound in their burial sheets. There were worms turning around inside the graves. Most of the bodies were alive. They were moving weakly inside their burial cloths. The bodies were in unusual positions. There was a feeling of great sadness and despair. The voice said again, "Isn't this an unhappy sight?" Before I could reply, the graves were suddenly closed. Noisy voices cried out in despair from under the ground. Isn't this a very unhappy sight? These night dreams continued to terrify me all the next day. I became nervous. I was frightened to leave my home. I stayed near people who knew of my condition. I even doubted my true friends. What if I became a trouble to them? Would they want to help me? My friends tried to comfort me. I made them promise not to bury me unless they could see the body changes that follow death. Nothing stopped my fear. I was anxious all the time. Just in case I was buried alive, I decided to prepare the vault. I had an inside lock put on the door so it could be easily opened from within. Entrances for light and air were built. Jars of food and water were placed within reach of the burial box. The box was lined with soft wool. It would be warm. The lid could be opened with the smallest movement. A large bell was hung from the roof of the vault. A rope from the bell would be tied to my body. If I moved, the bell would raise the alarm. However, even the most careful plans can fail. One day I was coming out of a cataleptic attack. At first I lay in a sleepy state. I realized that I had arms and legs. I touched my throat and chest. For a long time I lay still. I felt weak and slow. I heard ringing in my ears. Feeling returned to my fingers and toes. Suddenly I opened my eyes, fully conscious again. The beating of my heart was loud with terror. Where was I? I tried to remember what had happened. I felt I was not waking from an ordinary sleep. I knew that I suffered catalepsy. Horror! I wondered if my worst fears had happened. Had I been buried alive? I was too frightened to move. I opened my eyes in despair. It was dark. I knew the catalepsy had passed. I knew I could see again, but it was as dark as the night without a moon. I tried to scream. No sound came out of my dry mouth. I tried to breathe. My jaws were tied in the custom of dead bodies. I was lying in a hard, narrow space. I stretched my arms. They touched wood just a few inches above my face. I knew at last that I had been buried alive. In the middle of this terror came hope. I remembered all my safety plans. I pushed the lid, but it did not move. I could not find the rope. There was no soft wool around my body. Instead, I could smell wet earth. I was filled with despair. I realized I was not in my family vault. I had become cataleptic among strangers. They had buried me in a common grave. As I realized this awful truth, I screamed. A long, wild noise sounded through the dark night. "Hello, hello," said a rough voice. "What's the matter with you now?" asked a second voice. "Stop that noise," said a third. Two more voices added their comments. A group of men picked me up roughly. They shook me for several minutes. The shaking recovered my memory. A friend and I had been on a shooting trip near the river. We were caught in a storm. We looked for cover. All we could find was a small boat tied up in the stream. It was carrying a huge load of earth. I had climbed into a narrow wooden space to sleep. It had been difficult to press myself into the space. What happened to me was not a dream, and I had not been buried alive. My mistake came from my fear of being buried alive. It was also because of the difficulty I had recovering my memory after a cataleptic attack. The men who shook me worked on the boat. The smell was from the huge pile of earth. The cloth around my jaw was my own handkerchief. I had tied it there to cover my head. Thinking I was buried alive was real and horrifying. It was torture. However, out of this awful experience came good. I realized I could never allow myself to suffer this horror again. My life became more balanced. I exercised in the fresh air. I stopped thinking about death. I threw out my medical books. I stopped reading alarming stories about cemeteries. I took no more interest in stories of premature burial. Evil creatures no longer interested me. I changed and lived a normal life. The catalepsy disappeared. I think it had been caused by my strong fear of premature burial. There are times when our normal hope and joy leave us. We feel our lives are not important. We allow our imagined fears to control our lives. We have to control these fears or they will destroy us. The Murders in the Rue Morgue. Chapter 1. Monsieur Dupin. There is a form of intelligence described as logical. We judge this logical thinking by the end result. The strong man enjoys using the power and strength of his body. The logical man enjoys using his brain to solve puzzles. There seems to be magic in the way he gets results. However, the results are achieved by using a logical method, not magic. Let me give you an example. There are many different card games. Some are games of chance and luck. Other games need logic in order to play the game well. Watching how the game is played is important. There are some games in which all the players have equal chances. They would not be expected to make any mistakes. The winner would be the player who makes a surprise move. The logical person tries to think like the other player. He changes his usual game plan. The other player then makes the mistake. The logical person wins the game. All games have rules. It is important to know the rules. The logical player looks beyond the rules. He watches the game. He watches how the cards are sorted. He watches how they are dealt. He notices the faces of the other players. Do they pause? Do they look anxious? Do they look cross? After a few rounds, the logical person knows every card in every hand. There can be a big difference between logical thinking and being intelligent. They are not always the same thing. The logical person must be clever, but the clever person may not always be logical. There is a much smaller difference between having logical skills and having imagination. Logical people always have imagination. People with imagination are always logical. This story is about a mystery that appears difficult to solve. The story shows how logical thinking and imagination are used together with success. I lived for some time in Paris during the spring of 18. There I met Monsieur Auguste Dupin. This young gentleman came from a good family. By a run of bad luck, he had lost his money. He was so poor that he became sad and lost hope. He lost interest in life. He gave up trying to recover his lost income. His bank had allowed him to keep a small amount of money. This amount had come from his father's will. By spending the money carefully, he had enough for his daily needs. Books were his only pleasures. We first met in a small library on Montmartre Street. We discovered we had a common interest. We were both searching for the same rare book. As we searched for the books in various libraries, we kept meeting. I was amazed at how many books Dupin had read. I became interested in what he told me about his family. Like most Frenchmen, Dupin liked talking about himself. Most of all, I felt inspired by his fresh and busy imagination. I told Dupin I was looking for some particular objects. I hoped his knowledge of the city would be helpful in finding them. We decided to share a house during my stay in Paris. I had some money. Dupin allowed me to pay the costs on an ugly old house on Faubourg Street. The house had been empty for a long time. People said it was haunted. We furnished the house in an unusual style. It suited our creative natures. People would have been surprised if they had known our daily routine. They would have thought we were mad. No one visited. None of my previous friends knew of the house. Dupin was no longer known in Paris. We lived a very private life. My friend Dupin had an unusual love for and interest in the night. He enjoyed the night just because it was the night. I felt I was under a spell. I completely agreed with his strange ideas. At dawn, we closed all the windows. We read and wrote by the light of a candle. We talked and dreamed into the evening. When night came, we went out. Sometimes we walked on the dark streets. Sometimes the streets were bright. At times, we continued our conversations of the day. We watched for any situations that might test our intelligence. At these moments, I noticed Dupin had an unusual skill and liking for solving problems. He was proud of this logical skill. Laughing, he said that except for his own, the characters of most men were easy to read. He then described my own nature. I was surprised at his knowledge. As he spoke, his manner was distant. His eyes were blank. His usually deep voice rose to a high note. His speech was clear and measured. When he was in this mood, it seemed Dupin's mind was in two parts. Dupin, the man with imagination, and Dupin, the logical man. I'm not saying that Dupin was a romantic man. Even with his unusual way of thinking, Dupin did not use magic. Perhaps his imagination was very strong. Perhaps he had an unusual intelligence. I will explain what I mean. One night we were walking along a street near the king's palace. We had not spoken for some time. Suddenly, Dupin said He is so small he would be better acting in comic theater. Absolutely, I replied without thinking. Immediately afterward, I realized we had been thinking of the same subject at exactly the same time. I was amazed. Dupin, I said, how did you know what I was thinking? Did you read my mind? Why do you ask? You were saying to yourself that Chantilly was too small to act in the play. That is exactly what I was thinking. Chantilly used to mend shoes, yet he attempted to act a serious part in a play. How the public laughed at his poor acting. Chapter 2. Horrific Murders. Tell me for goodness sake, Dupin, how could we have had the same thought at the same time? Are you sure you are not reading my thoughts? It was the fruit seller, replied Dupin. The fruit seller? You surprise me. I don't know any fruit seller. Dupin said, Remember that man with the basket of apples? He nearly knocked you down as we passed the corner. Dupin, I said, what could a man with a basket of apples possibly have to do with Chantilly? I will explain, said Dupin seriously. Think back to the first moment I spoke. This was before the man bumped into you. Your thoughts were linked in this order: Chantilly, Orion, Dr. Nichols, teacher, pavements, street stones, fruit seller. You will be amazed at the distance from the first thought to the last thought. I considered Dupin's words. In a way, I could understand what he was saying. Most people have at some time wondered how they reached a particular thought. It was interesting and surprising to follow the links. Dupin continued, I remember we had been discussing horses. As we crossed the road, a man knocked you down. He was a fruit seller with a large basket on his head. The road was rough. You hurt your ankle when you stepped on a piece of stone. You looked cross and said a few words. You looked at the rough ground. You still had a cross look on your face. I could see you were still thinking about the stones. When we reached Lamartine Street, you looked more cheerful. You said the word pavements. The stone used to make these pavements is made of tiny pieces. This led you to the ideas of an old Greek teacher. He believed that the sun and stars were made of tiny pieces. This made you look up toward the sky. There you saw the group of stars called Orion. Now I knew I was following your thoughts. A magazine article appeared yesterday about Chantilly. You will remember that all he used to do was mend shoes. He was never shown how to act. The writer made a cruel statement about Chantilly's failure as an actor. He has ruined the old sound with the first letter. This is what he meant by that statement. Chantilly was a bad actor. As soon as he spoke the first lines, he ruined the play. Orion used to be called Urion. When you changed the first letter O of Orion to U, you changed the sound of the word. There is the link. When you smiled, I knew you had linked Chantilly with Orion. You suddenly stood up straight. I guessed you were thinking about the small size of Chantilly. It was just then I said, he is a very little man and would be better acting in comic theater. A short time had passed since the discussions about Chantilly. Dupin and I were reading the paper. There was an interesting article in the evening news. The headline read, Extraordinary Murders. Early in the morning, the people of the Roche area were awakened by a series of horrifying screams. The screams were coming from a house on Morgue Street. The house was owned by Madame L'Espanaye and her daughter Mademoiselle Camille L'Espanaye. The neighbors and police tried to enter. The doors were locked. They broke through the door with an iron post. By then the screams had stopped. They heard a violent argument coming from the top of the house. They rushed up the stairs. The sound stopped. The group divided and searched the house. They came to a back bedroom which was locked from inside. They broke the lock and entered the room. They were amazed at what they found. The bedroom was in a huge mess. The furniture was broken. The bed was thrown on the floor. A razor covered in blood lay on a chair. Near the bed were gray locks of human hair covered in blood. 2 bags of gold sat on the floor. The drawers in the desk were open and had been searched. The floor was covered with pieces of jewelry. A small iron safe was found under the bed. It was open with the key in the lock. There was no trace of Madame L'Espanaye. A pile of dust was lying under the chimney. They found the body of Mademoiselle L'Espanaye in the chimney. She had been violently pushed in upside down. Her body was warm. Her face and body had been cut. Her throat was darkly bruised. Finger marks on her neck showed she had been throttled. There was still no sign of Madame L'Espanaye. After another search, her body was found in the backyard. Her throat had been cut. The cut was deep. When she was moved, her head fell off. The damage to her body was horrible. She no longer looked like a human being. The next day, the newspaper reported that many people had been questioned. Witnesses had given statements to the police. Pauline Dubourg stated that she had washed the clothes of the L'Espanayes for 3 years. They paid well. Mother and daughter had a close relationship. She believed Madame could tell the future and had money. She had never seen any visitors at the house. Madame did not keep staff. Only the top floor of the house was furnished. Pierre Moreau stated that he had sold cigarettes to Madame for nearly 4 years. He had lived in the neighborhood all his life. Madame and Mademoiselle had lived in their house for 6 years. Madame led a simple life. The witness added that he rarely saw Mademoiselle. She and Madame had lived a very quiet life. He had heard that Madame had money. He had heard, but did not believe, she looked into the future. The doctor and the gate attendant were the only people he had seen at the house. Chapter 3. Police Investigations. The police continued to question people. The neighbors all gave the same evidence. No one visited the house. Relatives were not known. The front windows were seldom opened. The back bedroom windows were always closed. There were 2 other windows that were not closed. The windows of the large back room at the top of the house were left open. Isidore Mouzet, a policeman, stated that he had been called at 3 a.m. He arrived to find a group of people trying to enter the house. He forced the door open with a sharp tool. The screams were loud, long, and horrible. They stopped when he opened the door. The policeman led the neighbors upstairs. He heard 2 angry voices. One voice was rough. It sounded French. He was positive it was not a woman's voice. The other voice was shrill and strange. He thought it sounded Spanish and wasn't sure if it was male or female. He could not hear much of what was said, but he did hear the words damned and devil. The mess and the bodies were as described earlier. Henri Duval, a neighbor, agreed with the evidence of the policeman. He was one of the first to enter the house. He stated that they shut the door behind them to keep out the crowd. He thought the shrill voice sounded Italian, though he didn't know the Italian language. He was certain it was not French. He also was not sure if the voices were male or female, but he was sure the voices did not belong to the L'Espanayes. A Dutch witness who did not speak French gave his evidence with the help of an interpreter. He was passing the house and heard loud screams. They lasted 10 minutes. He agreed with most of the evidence given by Henri Duval. However, he thought the shrill voice was male and sounded French. He could not hear what was said. The speech was loud and rough. The voices sounded frightened and angry. He heard the rough voice say damned, devil, and my God. The police investigations continued. Everyone who knew Madame and her daughter were questioned. Jules Mignot, a bank officer, said that Madame owned some houses. She was a customer with his bank. She had put money into the bank over the past 8 years. She had taken some money out 3 days before her death. The amount was paid in gold. A bank clerk took the gold to Madame's house. Adolphe Lebon, a bank clerk, stated that he went with Madame L'Espanaye to her home. He carried the gold in 2 bags. He gave the money to the women at the door. He did not see anyone on the lonely street. William Bird, an Englishman, had lived in Paris for 2 years. He entered the house and was one of the first to go up the stairs. He also heard the 2 voices. The rough voice was French and male. He could make out several words at the time but could not remember them later. He clearly heard the words damned and my God. He also heard sounds of a fight. The shrill voice was very loud. He thought it sounded female and German, though he did not know the German language. 4 witnesses were called back. They all agreed that the bedroom door was locked. The windows were locked from inside. After they entered, everything was quiet. There was nobody upstairs. A door linking the bedrooms was closed but not locked. A door from the bedroom to the hall was locked from inside. There was a small room at the end of the hall. It contained old beds and other pieces of furniture. Everything was taken out and carefully examined. Every inch of the house was searched. The window on the roof had not been opened for years. People were not sure of the exact time between hearing the voices and entering the bedroom. The time was between 3 to 5 minutes. It had been difficult to open the bedroom door. Alfonso Garcia, a funeral worker, stated that he lived on Morgue Street. He was Spanish. He was among the first to go upstairs. He was too frightened to enter the bedrooms. He thought the rough voice was male and French. He could not hear what was said. He was sure the shrill voice sounded English, though he did not understand the English language. Alberto Montani, an Italian candy seller, stated that he went upstairs. He thought the rough voice belonged to a Frenchman. It seemed to be reasoning with someone. The shrill voice spoke quickly and roughly. He thought it was a Russian voice, though he had never spoken with a Russian. Several witnesses remembered that the chimneys were narrow. They were too small for anybody to have entered or escaped that way. Brushes called sweeps were pushed up and down every chimney on the top floor. There was no back door for anyone to escape through. The body of Mademoiselle L'Espanaye was tightly stuffed in the chimney. It took 4 people to pull her out. Paul Dumas, a doctor, stated that he was called at dawn. The 2 bodies had been placed in Mademoiselle's bedroom. The body of Mademoiselle was bruised and her skin badly cut. There were deep marks under her chin. Dark finger marks showed on her neck. Her face was purple. Pressure on her neck had made her eyes look huge. Her tongue had been bitten through. There was bruising on her stomach from the pressure of a knee. Dr. Dumas thought Mademoiselle L'Espanaye had been throttled by a stranger. The body of Madame was badly bruised and purple. Both legs were broken. There were injuries to her right arm and chest bones on the left side. Any strong man using a heavy object could have caused the injuries. The instrument may have been a club of wood or an iron bar. A woman would not have been strong enough. Dr. Dumas said that the head had come off the body. The throat had been cut with a sharp instrument, probably with a razor. Alexander Etienne, another doctor, agreed with the statements and opinions of Dr. Dumas. A few more people were questioned. The murders were the most unusual and mysterious crimes that had ever happened in Paris. That is, if they were murders. There were no clues to solving the mystery. The police were completely puzzled by the deaths of the 2 women. Chapter 4. Dupin has ideas. The evening newspaper stated that the events on Morgue Street were causing great local interest. The house had been searched again. Witnesses had been questioned several times. No new evidence had been found. There was a note at the bottom of the page. It mentioned that Adolphe Lebon, the bank clerk, had been arrested and put in prison, although there was no real evidence against him. Dupin seemed to be particularly interested in the progress of the investigations. He only asked my opinion after he heard Adolphe Lebon had been locked in prison. I said that I agreed with everyone else that finding the murderer would be very difficult. Dupin said, "Don't judge the difficulty of the case by the police investigations. Remember that French criminal that turned detective? He tried hard but had no method. In the same way, the police here have no method. They are very sly, but they are not clever. When they do solve the crime, it is usually by hard work and effort. But the solution is not always hidden. We often make a mistake by looking too deeply at a situation. We get a better picture when we look at a problem from the side. By trying to look too hard for the solution, we can lose the whole picture." Dupin continued, "Let's examine these murders ourselves. I am curious to know what really happened. I think we'll find the events interesting. Also, I received Lebon's help once. I know the chief of police. I'm sure he will let us enter the Morgue Street house." When we arrived, we found a crowd still standing at the front. Dupin walked around to a side street. From there, he examined the area at the back of the house. He examined all the side streets. He examined every inch of the neighborhood. He didn't say what he hoped to find. I could see no reason for this part of the search. We walked around the house to the front door. We rang the bell on the door. A policeman opened the door. He led us up to the bedroom where the 2 bodies still lay. Nothing had been touched in the room. Dupin examined everything, including the bodies. We looked in every room on the top floor. We searched the yard. The policeman stayed with us during our investigation. It was dark by the time we had finished. On the way home, Dupin called into the newspaper office. He gave me no explanation. Nothing more was mentioned about the murders that day. The next day, Dupin asked if I had noticed anything strange at the house. The way he said strange frightened me. I shook with a sudden fear. No, I said. Nothing more than was in the newspaper. Dupin said, the newspaper has highlighted the fact that the murders are so unusual. People seem to think the mystery can't be solved. The police can't find a reason for the murders. They can't understand why the murders were so violent. They are puzzled about the two voices. No one was discovered upstairs. There's no way out of the building except for the stairs. The police look stupid. They are confusing what is difficult to understand with what is unusual. What is so unusual about this crime? What is it about this crime that has never happened before? That's what the police should consider. It will be as easy for me to solve this mystery as it is difficult for the police. I stared at Dupin, my mouth open with amazement. Dupin looked toward the door. I'm now waiting for someone to arrive. Probably he's not guilty of the murders. However, he must take some of the blame for what has happened. If my ideas are correct, I will solve the whole mystery. If the man comes, we must keep him here. Here are my guns. He handed me the guns and I took them in surprise. Dupin went on speaking as if to himself. He said, the witnesses all agreed that the two voices did not belong to the murdered women. This proves Madame could not have murdered her daughter. Madame would not have been strong enough to push her daughter up the chimney. Madame could not have caused her own wounds or her own death. Therefore, the L'Espanays were definitely murdered. The arguing voices that were heard must have belonged to the murderers. Did you hear anything unusual in the statements? I said that all the witnesses agreed that the rough voice was French and male. None of them could agree about the shrill voice. True, said Dupin, but there was another unusual fact about the voices. As you said, all the witnesses agreed about the rough voice. It was not unusual that they couldn't agree about the shrill voice, but it was unusual for every witness to say the shrill voice was foreign. Here we have 5 people from the great nations of Europe. Not one person could pick out any familiar language. The voices wouldn't have been Asian. There are so few of them in France. I doubt if they would be from anywhere else. There has to be another reason. I will make 3 points. First, the voice was described by one witness as high rather than shrill. The second point, 2 others thought the voice was quick and rough. Last point, nobody could understand what was said. Dupin then asked, do you understand the point I am making? I have a few ideas about the voices. I think they are the clues to solving this crime. I had these clues in mind when we searched the bedrooms. My ideas have now become stronger. If they are correct, we will know how to proceed with this investigation. I will tell you later what I think really happened. Chapter 5. Dupin's Explanation. Dupin said, I said I would tell you what I think happened. Consider the bedroom of the Morgue Street house. How did the murderers escape? The L'Espanays were not killed by spirits. The murderers were real. They escaped in a real way. You ask how? Let us look carefully at the facts. There were 2 bedrooms. The murderers were in either one of these 2 rooms when the neighbors reached the stairs. The police didn't consider this fact. They searched everywhere in the house for hiding places. To satisfy myself, I looked again. I agreed there were no places for anyone to hide. The doors from the bedroom to the hall were locked from inside. Now, consider the chimneys. Even a cat couldn't have fit into the narrow spaces. The only way out must have been through the windows. The crowd below was watching the whole house. They would have seen anyone using the front windows. Therefore, the murderers must have used the back windows. How? This is what we must prove. There are 2 windows in the bedroom. One is clearly seen. The other is hidden by the bed. Both windows were held shut with strong nails. It was impossible to open either of the windows. The police were satisfied that nobody could have escaped this way. I was more particular with my investigation. However impossible the escape may have seemed, it must have happened. I was sure the murderers must have escaped through a back window, even though there is no way they could have shut the windows from the inside. That is the reason the police stopped their search. I decided the windows must have shut by themselves. I pulled the nail out of the window that was clearly seen. As I expected, it would not open. I realized there must be a hidden spring. I found the spring and was satisfied with my discovery. I did not try and raise the window. I put the nail back and had another careful look. I knew the nail could not have been put back in from the outside. It was obvious that the murderers could not have escaped through this window. I climbed on the bed and examined the second window. I found a matching spring behind the head of the bed. The nail was strong and looked exactly the same as the first one. By now, I was a little puzzled. So far, my ideas about the crime had been correct. There must be something different about this second nail. I touched it and the top slid off. The rest of the nail remained in the hole. I carefully put the head back. The break in the nail must have been caused by a heavy blow. It could not be seen. I pressed the spring and raised the window. The puzzle so far was solved. The murderers had escaped through the window behind the bed. Dupin paused. How did the murderers get down from the bedroom to the street? A lightning post was in place below the window. I had noticed this in my earlier walk around the house. It would be impossible to reach the window from the post. I saw there were shutters on the windows. The lower half formed an open frame made of wood. This frame made it easy to get a strong hold on the shutter. The shutters were only 2 feet from the lightning post. I realized then what was possible. An agile and daring person could get from the post to the shutter. Then I thought about the open window. He might even be able to spring directly into the bedroom. It would take amazing agility to make such a huge jump. I want you to think about this agility. I want you to understand that the agility is the key to solving the murders. The law might not agree with my ideas about the crime. That is not the point. I want to find the truth by using logic, not law. Here is another important fact. What is the link between the agility and the voices? Why could none of the witnesses agree about the shrill voice? As Dupin spoke, I began to understand a little of what might have happened. Dupin continued, Now I am considering how the murderers entered the house. I think they entered and left in the same way. Think again about the inside of the bedroom. The dressing table drawers were open. Perhaps none of the clothes had been stolen. Perhaps the clothes in the bedroom were all the l'espionage needed. The women seldom left the house. The clothes were good, so why were they not stolen? Why was the gold still sitting on the floor? How could robbery possibly be the reason for the murders? It was only by chance that the money had been delivered 3 days before the murders. These incidents of chance happen to us all the time. The police tried to link the murders with the delivery of the money. Logical people would have asked, is this probable? Now, suppose the gold had been stolen, then the gold could be linked to the murders. Suppose the murderers had come to steal from the house. Would they have been foolish enough to leave the gold behind? Dupin went on. Remember the points I made earlier? The strange voice, the amazing agility, the lack of any reason for the murders? Here is a woman throttled and stuffed in the chimney. Stuffing a body in a chimney is unusual, even for the most evil criminal. Think of the strength needed to push the body into that space. Think of how much effort that would take. Another thing. Madame's throat was cut so deeply that the head came off the body. This could not have been done with a small razor. Consider the violence of all these actions. Chapter 6. Clever Dupin. Dupin said, I have no knowledge about the injuries on Madame's body. Doctors Dumas and Etienne have said they were caused by an instrument. The instrument was the stone pavement upon which Madame fell. The police missed that simple piece of evidence. They also missed the evidence of the shutters. They assumed the windows had never been opened. Think about the horrible nature of the murders. Think about the foreign voice no one could understand. I felt myself shake as Dupin asked, Who would do this? A madman, I answered. Someone who has escaped from a place for mad people. I can understand why you would think that, said Dupin. However, a madman would still speak in his own language. Take the next bit of evidence. Look at this hair. It was caught in the fingers of Madame l'Espionage. What do you make of it? This is not human hair, I said, horrified. I did not say it was, said Dupin. Look at this drawing of the injuries. The doctors described bruising and finger marks on Mademoiselle's throat. You can see what this drawing means. Someone has kept a tight and terrible hold on the neck. Try to place your fingers over the marks. My fingers could not reach the marks. Well, try this, Dupin suggested. Bend the drawing around this piece of wood. The wood is about the same size as a throat. Now try again." This was even more difficult. It was obvious that no human hand could have made the marks. "Read the report in this science magazine," said Dupin. It was a description of a large orange orangutan. The description read, "It is a huge and dangerous creature with amazing strength and agility. It is a well-known fact that it is able to copy human sounds." At once I realized the full horror of the murders. "The finger marks in the drawing match those on the throat of Mademoiselle L'Espanaye," I said. "The orange hair matches the description in the report. But I don't understand about the two voices. Where's the link? Every witness said one voice belonged to a Frenchman. What about the shrill voice?" "Well," said Dupin, "remember the witnesses hearing the words, 'My God'? Montagny thought the voice had been arguing with someone. A Frenchman certainly must have been there. I don't think he actually did the killing. The orangutan may have escaped. The Frenchman may have followed it to the bedroom. In the terror that followed, it was impossible to catch the animal. It has still not been caught. All this is difficult enough for me to understand. It is very difficult to explain it to other people. For the moment, my ideas are just guesses." Dupin continued, "I placed a notice in a newspaper last night. This paper provides all the sea news for sailors. I believe the Frenchman is innocent of the murders. If that is true, he will call at our house today." Dupin handed me a newspaper. It read, "Caught, a very large orange orangutan. The owner is thought to be a Maltese sailor. Proof that he is the owner will be necessary. For a small charge, the animal can be collected from—" "What makes you think the owner is a Maltese sailor?" I asked. Dupin replied, "This ribbon was found at the foot of the lightning post. Sailors use these ribbons to tie back their long hair. Notice how the ribbon is tied? This tie is only used by the Maltese. If I am wrong about the ribbon, nothing will happen. If I am right, we will know the truth about the murders. Naturally, the Frenchman will have some doubts about coming here. This is how he will think. I am poor. My orangutan is valuable. Why not take the risk to get it back? It was found a long way from the murders. Who would ever consider a dumb animal guilty of murder? The police have not solved the crime. They have no clues. Even if they trace the animal here, there is no proof I knew about the murders. Whoever advertised states the orangutan belongs to me. I wonder how much he really knows. If I don't collect the animal, doubts might be raised. If I do collect the animal, will they link him to the murders? I don't want to bring notice to either of us. I will reply to his notice, but keep very quiet about the matter." "Be ready," said Dupin. "Don't show your guns or shoot unless I say so." Just then we heard someone enter the house. There was a pause, then steps were heard coming up the stairs. "Come in," called Dupin, in answer to the knock on the door. The man entered. He was a tall, handsome sailor. A beard covered the lower half of his face. He carried a huge wooden club. He spoke with a French accent. "Sit down," said Dupin. "I suppose you have come about the orangutan? You are lucky to own such a valuable animal. How old is he?" "About 5 years, I think," said the sailor. "Is he here?" "No," said Dupin. "He's at a yard nearby. Prove he's yours, and you can collect him in the morning." "Certainly," said the sailor. "I would like to pay you for finding the animal." "Well," replied Dupin, "let me think. Yes, the payment will be this. You will tell me everything you know about the murders on Morgue Street." Dupin spoke quietly as he stood and locked the door. He took a gun from his shirt. He placed it gently on the table. The sailor's face turned red. He breathed quickly as he waved the huge club. The next minute he sat down. He was shaking and his face went white. He looked like death itself. He said nothing. I felt very sorry for him. Chapter 7. The Sailor Tells the Truth. "My friend," said Dupin in a kind voice, "there is no reason to be alarmed. We won't hurt you. I know you are not guilty of the murders on Morgue Street. You weren't even guilty of robbery. You could not help what happened. But you cannot deny you had some part in the crime. You must tell me what you know. From what I have already said, you must realize that I have some information. There is an innocent man in prison charged with the crime." "So help me God," the sailor answered quietly. "I will tell you everything. I don't think you'll believe me. However, I am innocent. I will tell the truth even if it's the end of my life." The sailor went on to say that he had sailed on a voyage to the east a short time before. He and a friend had trapped the orangutan. The animal was violent and difficult to manage on the ship. The friend had died. Now alone, the sailor managed to get the orangutan back to France. The animal was locked up in the sailor's home. It had a wound on its foot. When the foot recovered, the sailor planned to sell the creature. Early on the morning of the murders, the sailor returned home after drinking with friends. He found the orangutan sitting at the mirror trying to shave. It had watched the sailor through a hole in the door. It had broken out of its locked room. The sailor was terrified to see the violent creature holding the razor. Sometimes the orangutan was in a bad mood. When this happened, the sailor hit the animal with a piece of rope. The rope controlled the animal even in its most violent moments. This time, the orangutan knew he had been particularly bad. He saw the sailor pick up the rope. The animal was frightened and jumped out the window. The sailor was extremely alarmed. He chased the orangutan along the streets. The animal stopped several times and looked back at the sailor. Then it ran on, still carrying the razor. The chase continued for a long time. Eventually, the sailor and the orangutan reached the lane behind Morgue Street. The animal noticed the light shining from Madame L'Espanaye's bedroom. It saw the lightning post under the window. With amazing agility, it swung from the post to the shutter and into Madame's bedroom. It kicked the shutter open as it entered the room. The sailor was pleased and anxious at the same time. He was pleased because he thought he could now catch the orangutan, and anxious because he was terrified of what the animal might do. It was easy for the sailor to climb up the lightning post. The shutter was out of reach, but he could still see into the bedroom. He nearly fell from the post in horror. He saw the orangutan carrying out the violent murders. The shrill screams came from the animal as it did the killing. They were the screams everyone heard on Morgue Street. Madame and her daughter had been putting papers into the iron chest. The orangutan sprang quietly into the room. He was not seen by the two women. By the time the sailor looked in, the huge animal was holding Madame by the hair. It was screaming in a shrill voice. It was waving the razor and pretending to shave her. In a rough voice, the sailor shouted at the animal to stop. Mademoiselle passed out with fright and lay unconscious on the floor. As Madame screamed and fought, the hair was pulled from her head. Madame's screaming drove the orangutan into a violent anger. With one powerful movement, it almost cut Madame's head from her body. The sight of the blood increased its anger to a fever of madness. It opened its mouth wide and showed its sharp teeth. With burning eyes, it jumped on the body of the girl. It sunk its huge nails into her neck. It held her by the throat until she was dead. The sailor watched the violence in horror. The orangutan looked up and saw the sailor watching him through the window. The animal's anger now turned to fear. It was frightened of punishment with the rope. In its rush to hide its evil acts, the furniture was thrown about and broken. The animal pushed Mademoiselle's body up the chimney. It threw Madame's body out the window. Terrified, the sailor slid quickly down the post and ran home. He was horrified by the murders. He was also scared about the murders being discovered. His fear made him completely forget about the safety of the orangutan. We later told the chief of police what had happened. Dupin ended by saying, "There is nothing much more to say about the murders. As you know, the first voice the witnesses heard was the sailor shouting out in horror. The strange, shrill voice was the screaming orangutan. It was wildly copying human sounds. The orangutan must have escaped down the lightning post. It closed the window as it came out of the bedroom. The sailor eventually caught the animal and sold it for a lot of money. After the chief learned the truth, Adolphe Lebon was freed from prison. The chief was annoyed that he did not solve the crime himself. "Let him complain," Dupin said later. "It might make him feel better. I'm pleased because I have beaten the police at their own job. It's not really surprising that our chief policeman did not solve the crime. He's too sly to think logically. He is not a man who thinks deeply. However, he is a good man. I particularly like the way he speaks about a situation when it's over. The chief is very good at talking. He talks about what is not important in the crime, but he fails to say anything important about it. That's why people think he is so clever." The Mask of the Red Death. For a long time, the Red Death had caused ruin through all the country. There was no cure for the disease. Bleeding was its beginning and its end. Blood poured from the body and broke open the skin. The affected person felt sharp pains. There was a sudden loss of balance. Red marks appeared on the body and face. Blood on the face was the strongest sign of the condition. People were too frightened to help each other. The whole course of the disease was only half an hour. Prince Prospero was a clever man. After half his population had died, he made a smart decision. He collected his attendants and special friends together. He took them to a safe and private castle. The castle was a beautiful building. Prince Prospero had planned the unusual design himself. A strong, high wall completely guarded the outside. Iron gates were built in the wall. The gates were joined with hot metal. Nobody could enter or escape from the castle. Food had been provided. Everyone would be safe from the Red Death. The prince said it was no use thinking about the Red Death. He provided many pleasures to amuse his guests. Comics told jokes. There were dancers, music, and wine. There were actors and beautiful women. 5 months had passed since the move to the castle. The Red Death was killing more people than ever before. Prince Prospero decided to hold a masked ball. The castle was prepared for the event. It was an expensive and exciting party. Inside the castle were 7 apartments. It was here the unusual design of the castle was at its peak. Only one apartment could be seen at a time. There was a sharp turn every 20 yards along the corridor. Each turn opened onto a new scene. In the middle of each wall was a narrow window. This window opened into each apartment. The color of the glass matched the color of the apartment. The east apartment and its window were blue. The second apartment had purple furnishings and window glass. The third apartment and its window were green. The fourth apartment and its window were orange. The fifth was all white. The sixth had violet walls and glass. The seventh apartment was different. It was black, except for the windows. They were deep red. They were the color of blood. There were no ceiling lights in any of the apartments. There were no lamps or candles. Outside each apartment was a heavy stand. Inside each stand, a fire burned in a metal dish. The light from the fires shined through the colored glass. It formed strange shapes in the rooms. The shapes through the red windows of the black room were particularly horrible. People were too terrified to enter that apartment at all. A huge black clock stood against the wall in the black apartment. Its long metal parts swung with a heavy chime. Each time the clock chimed the hour, people paused in fear. The sound of the chime was strange and alarming. The musicians stopped playing. People stopped dancing. Nervous people became more nervous. Old people became confused. When the last chime had sounded, everyone relaxed. People were embarrassed to have shown their fear. They said, "Next time the clock chimes, we will not be afraid." But every chime produced the same fear as before. Even considering the fear produced by the chimes, the masked ball was a wonderful party. There was a feeling of magic and excitement everywhere. The prince had brilliant and unusual ideas. Some people would have called him mad. Every guest was dressed as a different character. There were classical dancers with arms and legs in strange positions. There were characters of beauty, characters that looked mad, and some that looked cruel and evil. The characters moved in and out of the apartments like creatures from dreams. Their clothes took on the colors of the windows. They danced in a wild mood to the music. When the black clock chimed, the characters stopped in fear. When the chimes died away, the music and laughter started again. None of the guests dared enter the black apartment. The red glass shined more brightly than the other windows. The apartment seemed darker than ever. The chimes of the black clock sounded like a warning. In the 6 other apartments, the ball was in progress. That is, until midnight. There would be 12 chimes. Again, people felt anxious. The dancers stopped. Serious people stood still and considered the strange feelings that followed the chimes. The last chime of midnight sounded. By this time, many people were standing silently. They noticed a figure wearing a mask. Everyone started whispering in surprise. Then their expressions changed to horror and then disgust. This figure went beyond any normal level of good behavior. Who would make this awful joke? The figure was tall and thin. He was dressed in burial clothes. Even his mask looked like a dead body. Horror! He was dressed as the Red Death. His clothes were covered in blood. Red marks covered his face. The horrible creature walked slowly among the people. Prince Prospero shook with emotion. He became very angry. He shouted at the man, "How dare you come here dressed in that manner? Attendants, take hold of this man. Tear off his mask. Then we will know who to hang at dawn." Prince Prospero spoke loudly from the blue apartment. His words could be heard in every room. The music stopped. The prince's attendants looked white with terror. The stranger walked with silent steps toward the prince. A terrible fear passed through the crowd. Nobody dared move. The crowd stood back against the walls. The mysterious figure walked past all the guests. With a slow step, he walked past the prince. In this measured way, the stranger walked through all the apartments. The prince was angry with himself. He was annoyed that he had shown his fear. He pulled out a knife and held it high above his head. He hurried after the masked figure. The stranger had now reached the black apartment. He turned to face the prince. Suddenly, there was a sharp cry. The knife fell on the black carpet. The prince fell dead on the floor. In angry fear, the guests rushed at the stranger. They pulled at his clothes and his mask. Horror! There was no body under the clothes. It was the spirit of the Red Death himself. One by one, the people dropped dead. Their bodies were covered with blood. They fell down in positions of despair. After the final guest had died, the black clock stopped. The fires in the iron stands went out. Everything was in darkness and ruin. The Red Death held power over the country forever and ever. The Black Cat. Chapter 1. Pluto and Alcohol. I am going to tell you a strange story, although it is about a very ordinary subject. I would be mad to expect you to believe me, but I am not mad. I know I am not dreaming. Tomorrow I am going to die. Today I want to make peace with the world. I have been haunted by the results of my actions. They have destroyed me. It has been horrible. Other people might find the facts more curious than horrible. I hope I can find a clever person to help me, a person who is logical and calm and can explain these awful experiences. I had been known for my kind nature since I was a child. My friends even joked about my gentle ways. I especially loved animals. My parents gave me many pets. I spent most of my time with these creatures. This love of animals continued when I became an adult. A pet can often be a better friend than a selfish human. I married early. My wife noticed my love of pets. She collected some animals for our home. Among these was a black cat. He was a huge and beautiful creature. His intelligence was amazing. My wife often said that black cats knew magic. Anyway, that's not important. The memory just came into my mind. The cat was called Pluto. He was my favorite pet. He followed me everywhere. It was difficult to stop him from following me outside the house. We remained friends for several years. During this time, I started drinking large amounts of alcohol. My nature changed. My moods became worse each day. I became horrible. I shouted at my wife. After a while, I hit her. My pets felt the change in my nature. I was cruel to them. I still liked Pluto enough not to hit him. I hit all the other animals. I drank more and more alcohol. My nature became more horrible and cruel. Now even Pluto began to suffer from my evil moods. I returned home one night after drinking heavily. I could sense that Pluto was avoiding me. I took hold of him in a rough and cruel way. In his terror, he bit me on the hand. I became angry. I lost all reason. My early kind nature disappeared. Now I was an evil alcoholic. My whole body was filled with hatred. I took out my knife. I held Pluto by the throat and cut out one of his eyes. Now I shake and burn with guilt as I write about this horrible act. By morning I had slept off the effects of the alcohol. I remembered what I had done. I felt a mixture of guilt and horror, but I was not truly sorry. I became drunk again to blot out the memory of my cruel act. The cat slowly recovered. He looked ugly, but he was free of pain. When he saw me, he ran away in terror. At first, I was sorry that Pluto hated me, but my feelings of regret soon changed to anger. There was no kindness left in my character. My bad behavior had no logical reason. Even knowing how I should have behaved made no difference. Now, I am sure that behaving badly is a basic human characteristic. It affects us all our lives. How many times have we done something silly or bad just because it was against the law, even when we knew that it was wrong? The ruin of my character was complete. I had a strange desire to do evil. I wanted to be especially cruel to the black cat. One morning I put a rope around Pluto's neck. I hanged him from the branch of a tree. As I did this, I cried with great regret. I knew the cat had loved me. I hanged it simply because I knew it was an evil act. That night I woke up suddenly. My bed and the whole house were on fire. With difficulty, my wife, an attendant, and I escaped. The house was destroyed. I had lost everything I owned. I felt despair. I am not saying the fire was a punishment because I had murdered the cat. I just want you to know every part of the story. The day after the fire, I visited the ruins. Only one thin wall remained, the bedroom wall. It was probably because the wall was new. A huge crowd had collected. They were examining the wall with great interest. I heard the words strange and extraordinary. I was curious and approached the wall. As I looked, I saw a picture on the wall in the shape of a huge cat. There was a rope around the cat's neck. I thought I was seeing a ghost. My amazement and terror were extreme. Then I remembered. The cat had been hanged from a tree. When the alarm was raised, the crowd had run into the garden. Someone must have cut the cat down from the branch. The creature had been thrown into my bedroom to wake me. All the other house walls had fallen down. As they fell, they pressed the cat into the new soft wall. The strange picture had been made by a mixture of chemicals which had run into the wall from the body of the dead cat. I understood how the strange picture had been formed, but even so, seeing the picture in the shape of the cat made me feel anxious. I kept thinking about the picture on the wall for months afterward, and was always overcome by the same anxiety and terror. I was not really sorry about killing Pluto, but I had some regret that I no longer owned a cat. I decided to look for another. I searched all the local pubs for a cat similar to Pluto. One night I was drinking in a rough bar. I noticed a dark object sitting on top of a huge drum of alcohol. It was a large black cat. It looked very like Pluto. However, Pluto had been completely black. On this cat's chest, there was a white mark formed in a strange shape. It seemed delighted when I touched his head. This is exactly the type of cat I wanted. I offered to buy the cat from the man in the bar. No one owned the cat, so I let the creature come home with me. Chapter 2. Alcohol and Murder. The cat made itself at home very quickly. He became a great favorite with my wife. It was not long, however, before I stopped liking the animal. It was a surprise when the cat showed a great liking for me. This liking filled me with disgust and anger. Slowly, the disgust and anger turned to hatred. I avoided the creature as if it had a disease. My fear about what happened after I had murdered Pluto stopped me from hurting the animal. My hatred of the cat increased even more when I discovered the animal only had one eye. To think that kindness had once been the best part of my nature. The more I avoided the cat, the more it liked me. It was difficult to understand. When I sat down, it would sit under my chair. Sometimes it sprang onto my knee. When I walked, it ran under my feet. It even climbed up my leg to my chest. I wanted to kill the animal, but my terror prevented the actual murder. The terror is difficult to describe. Even as I sit here in prison, I am embarrassed when I remember my evil actions. My wife had often mentioned the white hair on the cat's chest. The white hair was the only difference between it and Pluto. My terror of the cat was the result of my wild imagination. Remember I said the white mark was a strange shape? By degrees, the white mark changed. I tried not to worry about what I noticed, but the white mark had become an object of terror. When I looked at it, I saw a tall wooden frame. There was a rope hanging from the top of the frame. It was the terrible instrument of crime and horror, the instrument of hanging and death. By then, my despair was beyond all human reason. It was caused by a dumb animal and my wild imagination. I could not sleep. The creature with the white mark was with me every minute. I woke every hour to find it breathing on my face. It sat on my chest. It was like living a terrible dream. The last trace of my good character was gone. I lost all reason. My thoughts became completely evil. My evil thoughts turned to hatred of all things and all people. I had sudden terrible bursts of anger. I was cruel to my patient wife. One day, we went down to the basement of our home. The cat followed us and caused me to trip and fall. My anger turned to madness. I picked up a tool and tried to hit the cat. The blow was stopped by my wife. How angry I was when she prevented the killing. My anger became more than an evil madness. I pushed my wife's hand away. I drove the tool deep into her brain. Without a sound, she fell down dead. Once the horrible murder was done, I had to hide the body. If I took it from the house, the neighbors would see me. I considered cutting the body into pieces and burning them. I thought of digging a grave in the basement. Could I put her down the well in the yard? I wondered about putting the body into a box and sending it away. Finally, I had an idea. I would hide my wife's body in the basement itself. The basement walls were suitable. They had recently been covered with new material. The basement was wet, which had kept the walls soft. One of the walls was different. It had been filled up to look like the rest of the room, but the bricks inside were loose, and there was a hole behind it. I was sure I could lift out these bricks. I would put the body inside and cover over the opening. Using a heavy tool, the bricks came out easily. I put the body standing up inside the hole in the wall. The bricks were easy to return. With great care, I covered the hole in the bricks. I was pleased with the final result. I had decided, at last, to kill the cat. But where was that horrible creature hiding? The cat was clever. It was hiding from my violent anger. I felt a peace I cannot explain when the cat was out of sight. It did not appear that night. For once, I slept well, even though I had just murdered my wife. Several days passed. There was still no sign of the terrifying cat. Once again, I felt great peace. The horrible creature had left the house forever. I was happy I would never see it again. I did not feel guilty about the murder. A few people asked about my wife. I made up ordinary excuses. The house had been searched. I felt quite safe about my crime. A few days after the murder, some police officers arrived at my door. They made another very careful search of the house. I was not a bit worried. The hiding place in the basement would never be discovered. The officers ordered me to come with them. We went down to the basement for the 4th time. I walked about feeling quite calm. The police were satisfied my wife was not there. They prepared to leave. I could not control my pleasure. "Gentlemen," I said, "I am pleased you think I'm innocent. Thank you all for coming. By the way, gentlemen, this house has been built very well. These walls are very strong." I knocked heavily on the bricks. I knocked exactly over the place where my wife was hidden. May God save me from that evil cat. I had hardly finished knocking when I heard a strange sound from inside the wall. It was a broken cry like a sad child. Then the sound became a long, loud scream. The sound was not human. The scream became longer and louder. The terrible noise sounded like the spirits of people dying under the earth. Words cannot express my feelings of horror. For a moment, the policemen stood still in terror. They recovered quickly and pulled the bricks from the wall. The body was standing up in front of us. It was covered with dried blood. Sitting on the head was a black shape. Its screaming red mouth was open, and its single eye shined like fire. This terrible creature had turned me into a murderer. Now it would cause me to be hanged for the crime. I had shut the horrible cat inside the wall. A Tale of the Ragged Mountain. Chapter 1. Cloud and Hypnosis. During the fall of 1827, I was living near Charlottesville, Virginia. There I met a gentleman called Mr. Augustus Bedloe. Mr. Bedloe was an interesting and very unusual person. I was curious to know more about him. It was difficult to find out anything about his family or friends. I had no idea where he had lived before. He seemed to be a young man. However, there was something about him that puzzled me. Although he talked about being young, he sometimes seemed very old. The most unusual thing about him was his appearance. I had never seen such a strange face. He was extremely tall and thin. His shoulders were bent over. The bones in his arms and legs were particularly long. Above his eyes, his forehead was broad and low. His face was completely white. His large mouth stretched wide open when he spoke. Although his teeth were rough, they showed no sign of disease. The expression on his face was always pleasant, but it was always sad. He smiled in a sad way. He always looked as if something unhappy were about to happen. His eyes were huge and round. They reminded me of a cat. When Bedloe was excited, his eyes shined like the sun. At other times, his eyes looked blank, as if he had died. When it was light, Bedloe's eyes were narrow. When it was dark, his eyes opened wide. Bedloe's strange appearance troubled him very much. He was always talking about how he looked. Sometimes he almost apologized for his strange face. At first, I felt sorry for him. After a while, I became used to how he spoke about himself. I stopped feeling pity for him. He said to me that he had once been handsome. The change had been caused by attacks of facial nerve pain. He had been having the attacks for many years. For a long time, he had been looked after by an old man named Dr. Templeton. Bedloe felt he received great help from the doctor. Bedloe was very rich. He arranged to be the only patient in Dr. Templeton's care. For this care, Dr. Templeton received a large amount of money each year. Dr. Templeton had traveled to Paris as a young man. While he was there, he became very interested in hypnosis. Dr. Templeton believed it was his hypnotic treatment that helped Bedloe. Bedloe also came to believe in the power of hypnosis and was finally persuaded to help Dr. Templeton in some hypnotic tests. The tests were repeated many times. From these tests, an unusual situation developed. It was a situation that was new in the year 1827. Now, in 1845, hypnosis is no longer unusual. A strong and unusual hypnotic relationship grew between Dr. Templeton and Augustus Bedloe. At first, Dr. Templeton could not hypnotize Bedloe into sleep. Dr. Templeton tried over and over again. On the 12th attempt, the hypnosis worked. After that, all Dr. Templeton had to do was think about Bedloe. It made no difference if Bedloe was with Dr. Templeton or not. The minute the doctor thought about Bedloe, Bedloe would fall into a hypnotic sleep. This hypnotic link had never been heard of before. Bedloe was a bright young man. He was quick to take advantage of new situations. He always wanted to try any new activities. His imagination was particularly strong and creative. His imagination was probably increased by his drug habit. He could not live without taking drugs. Every morning he took large amounts of morphine with a strong cup of coffee. He did not eat breakfast. It was his habit not to eat any food before the afternoon. His days always started in the same way. After the coffee, he set out for a long walk. He always walked in the same direction. To the west of Charlottesville was a group of wild and gray hills. Because of their appearance, they were called the Ragged Mountains. His adventure began one day at the end of fall. Bedloe started out for his routine walk. It was a cloudy morning, but still warm. Winter had not yet begun. Bedloe walked as usual toward the hills. By the evening, he had not returned. We became worried about his safety and decided to go and search for him. We were just leaving when suddenly he returned. He was well and had no injuries. He even seemed to be more cheerful than usual. His description of the day was extraordinary. "You will remember," he said, "that it was early when I left Charlottesville. I walked quickly to the mountains. About an hour later, I entered a deep mountain pass. I had never seen this pass before. It was very interesting. The pass wound through the mountains. The scenery on both sides of the pass was quite usual. I had a wonderful feeling of being alone. It was a feeling I had never had before. I felt that I was the very first person to have walked there. The entrance to the pass is hidden. It would be very difficult to reach. The climb would be too steep and rough for most people to manage. There is often a thick cloud in the mountains at this time of late summer. The cloud is like smoke and hangs over everything. It was difficult to see anything of the mountains at all. The grass and rocks took on strange shapes around me. I enjoyed being hidden in the cloud. Chapter 2. Eastern Adventure. The cloud became so thick I could only see a very short distance in front of me. The path turned and wound its way through the mountain pass. There was no sign of the sun. I had no idea where I was going. The drug had its usual effect on me. Even considering the low cloud, everything around me seemed fresh and clean. I noticed the light color of a flower, water shining on a leaf, the soft wind, and the smell of the forest. From all these sensations came a happy mixture of thoughts that were romantic and more unusual than ever before. I walked on for several hours enjoying the feelings. By then, the cloud was so thick I could not see where I was going. I had to put my hands out in front to feel the way. Instead of happy thoughts, the thick cloud now filled me with worry. A feeling of terror came over me. I stopped and shook with fear. What if I fell down a steep rock face? I remembered hearing stories about the Ragged Hills, stories about wild, rough men who lived in caves in the forest. I could not control my imagination. Suddenly, I heard the loud beating of a drum. I was amazed. Nothing could have surprised me more. A moment later, I was even more amazed. This time, I heard a ringing noise. The noise sounded like a large set of keys being shaken. At the same time, a dark man rushed past me. He was not wearing many clothes. He shouted as he ran close by me. I could feel his hot breath on my face. In one hand, he carried an instrument. It was made of metal rings. He shook it as he ran. He disappeared into the cloud. Immediately behind the running man came a huge creature. It had shining eyes and its mouth was open wide. I knew at once this wild animal was an Asian dog. Strangely enough, the sight of this ugly creature calmed my terror. I became sure I was only dreaming. I tried to wake myself. I stood up straight. I moved forward. I rubbed my eyes. I called out. I pressed hard on my arms and legs. I looked around and noticed a pool of water. I bent down and washed my hands, head, and neck. The cool water made me feel much calmer. My anxiety was gone. I felt peaceful and continued on my walk. After a short time, I felt very tired. The air was heavy and still. I sat down to rest under a tree. The weak sun shined through the trees. I noticed the leaves that had fallen on the grass. I looked at the shape of the leaves in amazement. I looked up at the tree above me. It was a tree only found in a hot climate. How could this tree be growing in this cold mountain climate? I stood up quickly. I was really anxious. I couldn't pretend I was dreaming any longer. I knew I could move. My arms and legs moved as usual. I could hear sounds and see around me. All my senses were perfectly normal. A new and extraordinary feeling came over me. The forest became very hot. The wind blew strange smells toward me. I could hear the gentle sound of running water. There was a low whisper of many human voices. I listened to these sounds in amazement. It is difficult to describe them. While I stood and listened, there was a sudden strong rush of wind. It blew away the cloud as if by magic. I found myself at the foot of a high mountain. I looked down and across a huge plain. The plain stretched away into the distance. A beautiful river wound its way across the flat land. On the sides of the river was a city. I had read about cities like this in stories of Arabia, but it was even more unusual than any of the cities I had read about. I stood high above the town. It was like looking at a map. I could see every corner of every street. The streets were long and narrow and crossed each other. They were crowded with men and women. The houses were beautiful and different from any I had ever seen. Balconies were built on every wall. There were churches of all shapes and designs. Some had tall, slender parts reaching high above the city. Some were large and wide. Famous religious figures were shaped from stone and rock. Interesting designs were painted on the window frames. The streets were lined with small shops. Articles for sale filled the counters. There were piles of rich material for making clothes. Shining knives and forks lay side by side. Beautiful jewels lay waiting to be made into necklaces. Precious stones of every color and shape were in boxes on the counter. It was an amazing sight. Flags were flying everywhere. 4 strong men carried another man on a chair seated high on their shoulders. Ladies wearing beautiful clothes passed by with their faces covered. Horses wearing blankets of every color mixed with the crowd. People played musical instruments. Children hit the sides of drums. Men with beards waved clubs in the air. Many of the women had colored cloths wound around their heads. The noise was very loud. Sacred cows walked through the crowd. Sacred apes climbed and sat everywhere. Sometimes they sat on the cows. They hung onto the balconies. They ran through the churches. Some sat on the window frames. The apes were dirty creatures. As they climbed, they screamed with delight. Chapter 3. History repeated. Many ships were tied up on the river. The movement of the river was slowed by the ships with their heavy loads. Long rows of steps led from the streets to the water. People used special parts of the river to wash themselves. Far outside the city was a large forest. Some of the trees were very old. Some were very different from the mountain trees. There were huge numbers of trees that grow in hot climates. Rice grew in fields of water. A few churches could be seen. Some simple houses could be seen among the trees. A young girl carried a jug of water on her head. You will probably say to me that I was dreaming. At first I thought I may have been, but what I saw and heard made sense. What I felt and thought was not a dream. Just as before, I tested myself to see if I was really awake. Then I knew it was not a dream. Instead, it was an amazing experience. Then Dr. Templeton spoke for the first time. I am sure that you are quite correct in saying it was not a dream, he said. But please continue. You watched the scene for some time. You walked down into the city. Bedloe looked at Dr. Templeton in amazement. How did you know? I did walk down to the city, as you say. On my way down, I got caught up in a huge crowd. They were pushing through the streets. Everyone was going in the same direction. People were shouting in wild excitement. Suddenly, I had a very strange desire to find out what was causing the excitement. I felt I had an important part to play. I didn't understand what it was. I hated the people who crowded around me. I stood back from them. I walked off in another direction. I chose a path that turned and wound its way down the hill. I reached the city quickly. Noise and confusion were everywhere. A British officer was leading a small group of men in a battle. The men were dressed in a mixture of Indian and European clothes. They were fighting a rough crowd in the streets. It was very confusing. I had no idea who they were fighting. I picked up a fallen stick and joined the battle. It was not long before we were losing the fight. We took cover in a small building. Using lengths of wood, we managed to close off the entrance. For the moment, we were safe. I looked through a small window in the building. I saw a huge crowd. They were wild and angry. Some of them were attacking the walls of a large palace. The palace was built very close to the river. As I watched, a man climbed out of a top window. He held a rope as he climbed down into a waiting boat. He had used torn pieces of clothing to make the rope. The cloth had been pulled from the clothes of his attendants. The boat took him quickly to the opposite side of the river. Immediately, I had an idea. I spoke a few quick words to the group with me. A number of them agreed with my suggestion. We rushed from our hiding place. We ran hard into the crowd that was waiting outside. The crowd moved backward. They came forward again and fought hard against us. Again they backed away when we ran forward. Once more they rushed forward, and the strength of their movement carried us along with them. We found ourselves in a mix of narrow streets. Along the streets were tall houses. It was dark. The tall houses blocked the sun from reaching the street. The crowd attacked us with their guns and sticks. They shot arrows at us. The arrows were unusual. They were shaped like long black snakes. The tips of the arrows were covered with poison. One of them hit me on the right temple. I bent over and fell to the ground. I felt terribly ill. I fought. I groaned. I died. I decided to speak. Surely you can't say this whole adventure was real. You must have dreamed everything that happened. Are you saying you are still dead? I thought Bedloe would answer me with a joke, but to my amazement he paused and shook. His face went white. He did not say a word. I looked at Dr. Templeton. He sat straight up in his chair. He sweated with fright and his mouth shook. Finally, he spoke to Bedloe. Continue your story. Bedloe started to speak again. For a long time I felt I was not real. It was dark and death was by my side. I stayed like this for some time. Suddenly, a feeling went through my head. It was like an electric charge. I had a sense of being able to stretch in any direction. I felt very light. At once I seemed to lift off the ground, but there was nothing to see, hear, or feel of me. The crowd had moved away, the violence had stopped, and the city was quiet. Below me lay my body. The arrow was still stuck in my temple. My whole head was huge and ugly. I felt, rather than saw, all these things. Nothing interested me. I had no interest even in my body. I had no will to act or move. I appeared to be moving along above the ground. I followed the same path I had used to enter the city. I reached the place in the mountain pass where I had seen the wild dog. Again I experienced a feeling like an electric charge. The sense of weight, will, and body returned. I was normal again. I hurried home. Chapter 4. Dr. Templeton explains. Dr. Templeton, everything I experienced seemed very real. I cannot believe for 1 minute that it was a dream. No, it was not a dream, said Dr. Templeton, looking very serious. But what else could we call it? I suppose we might be on the edge of an amazing discovery about the human mind. For the moment, however, that is just an idea. I have some other explanations for you about what has happened. Look at this watercolor drawing. I should have shown it to you earlier. My fear and horror about the drawing has prevented me. I really cannot explain why. We looked at the picture together. I could see nothing unusual about the drawing, but the effect on Bedloe was surprising. He looked horrified. It was just a small picture, and it was an exact copy of Bedloe's unusual face. You will notice the date on the picture, said Dr. Templeton. It was painted in 1780. It is the picture of a friend of mine who is now dead, a man called Mr. Oldeb, whom I met in India. We became very close friends. I was only 20 years old at the time. When I first saw you, Mr. Bedloe, I was amazed. The likeness between you and this painting was so similar. That is why I introduced myself. I wanted to become your friend. After we had become friends, I began to look after your health. I finally became your doctor and assistant. I did this for 2 reasons. First of all, I have a memory of Mr. Oldeb that I regret. The second reason is that, in a strange way, I am very curious about you yourself. Dr. Templeton continued, You have told me about a dream you had in the Ragged Mountains. You described every part of a city. The city is real. It is the Indian city of Benares. It is built on the side of a sacred river. The violence, fighting, and death are true events. They took place in 1780. They happened when a man called Keta Singh tried to take power away from the government. It was Keta Singh himself who escaped from the window of the palace. The British officer in charge was a man called Warren Hastings. He led a group of Indian soldiers who were working for the British. That was the group that took cover in the little building. I was in that group. We fought as hard as we could against a strong enemy. They crowded the street in their huge numbers. I tried to prevent the death of the officer who was hit by the poisoned arrow. He was hit by the arrow when he rushed out into the crowd. He was very brave but not careful. He died in the crowded street. That officer was my best friend. It was Oldeb. It is very curious. At the same time you dreamed these events, I was writing about them at home. Here are all the notes I wrote. You can see that the writing on these pages is new and fresh. About a week after the conversation about Oldeb, a notice appeared in a Charlottesville newspaper. It is with great sadness we report the death of Mr. Augustus Bedloe. He was a respected and popular gentleman in Charlottesville. Mr. Bedloe has suffered facial nerve pain for many years. Many times he was not expected to live. However, the nerve pain was not the immediate cause of his death. He recently visited the Ragged Mountains. While he was there, he developed a cold. The cold produced a fever. The high temperature caused Mr. Bedloe to become very hot in the face and head. His doctor tried to cool the fever by placing medicinal worms on the head. Medicinal worms are small creatures that take blood from the body. Taking the blood removes the heat from the face and head. Immediately after the worms had been put in place, Mr. Bedloe died. Dr. Templeton always keeps his medicinal worms in a small jar. By mistake, a poisonous worm had been placed in the same jar. This was the worm that was placed on Mr. Bedloe's temple. The poison from the worm entered the body of Mr. Bedloe. Mr. Bedloe died immediately. The mistake was not discovered until it was too late. There was a note at the bottom of the page. It was an unusual mistake to make. The poisonous worm and the medicinal worm look very similar. However, the difference can always be seen. The poisonous worm is completely black and moves very much like a snake. I was speaking later with the writer of the newspaper article. We discussed the strange death of Mr. Bedloe. I asked him why he had spelled the name Bedlo and not Bedloe. He replied, "It was a typing mistake. Nobody suggested that I should change the spelling of the name. Everybody knows that Bedloe is always spelled with an E at the end. I have never seen it spelled any other way." Well, I said to myself as I turned away to leave, truth is very much stranger than any story. Think about this amazing fact. Bedloe without the E is Oldeb spelled backward. And this man is trying to tell me it was simply a typing mistake?
Playlet. Tales of Mystery and Imagination. The criminal Gustav is sitting in prison. He is about to tell his story to a visitor. He is to be hanged tomorrow and wants to die in peace. Please, sit down. I want to tell you a very strange story. I am not mad. I am not dreaming. Tomorrow I will be hanged.
Are you saying you want to make peace with the world?
Yes, something like that. I doubt if you'll believe me.
I have heard many strange tales in prison. Please begin.
Once I was a very kind person. I loved animals.
Did you own a pet?
Ah, yes, Minnie. I had a beautiful black cat. I called him Pluto.
Is he still alive?
Gustav sobs quietly into his hands. No. May God spare me from final damnation.
Please, go on.
Pluto followed me everywhere. It was then that I started to change.
What changed you?
The drink. The evil alcohol.
Were you married?
Yes. To a patient, good woman.
Did your wife stay?
Yes. But I became cruel and horrible. I hit her.
Did you get angry with Pluto?
Not at first. One day, he ran under my feet. I tripped and fell.
Were you drunk?
Yes. I picked the cat up and cut out one of his eyes. Visitor moves back on chair.
Did he recover?
Yes, but he looked ugly. He hid from me after that.
Were you sorry about the cat?
At first, I was sorry about what I had done.
Did you make friends again with Pluto?
No, I drank more and more.
Please continue.
I became very angry that Pluto was hiding from me. I wanted to be evil just for the sake of being evil.
Yes?
One morning, I put a rope around Pluto's neck and hanged him from the branch of a tree. Visitor again moves back slightly on chair.
Did you understand why you hanged him?
Not really. I need someone to explain my horrible behavior.
What did you tell your wife?
Nothing. She found out later.
Was she upset?
Yes, she particularly liked him because he only had one eye.
And your wife now?
Gustav shakes and sobs again. Oh, spare me. I will tell you shortly. Just after this, my house burned down.
Did you lose everything?
Yes, everything I owned.
Did you think it was a punishment?
I wondered. Only one thin wall of the house was left standing. On the wall was the shape of a huge cat.
What formed the shape?
When the fire started, neighbors threw the cat into the bedroom to wake me. His shape pressed into the soft wall. Chemicals on the wall mixed with liquids from his body. That's what made the strange shape. I was terrified.
Even though you understood why the shape was unusual?
Yes, but it made no difference to the terror I felt.
Did you miss the cat?
Well, I missed having a cat. I found another one like Pluto, but this one had a white mark on its chest.
Did you like this cat?
At first. For some reason, the cat liked me. This liking made me angry. My anger turned to hatred.
Why did you hate the animal?
I discovered it only had one eye.
What did you do about it?
I longed to kill the creature.
What stopped you?
I kept remembering Pluto. My terror about killing him stopped me.
What did you do about the cat?
I'm embarrassed telling you, but I must. Tomorrow will be too late.
Please continue.
I became even more terrified about the white mark on the cat. My imagination was now out of control. I was beyond help.
Why? Was there no one to help you see reason?
No, the cat never left my side. I hated it. By degrees, the white mark on its chest changed shape. I tried to be sensible about what I saw, but the mark had now become an ugly reminder of horror of Pluto's death. I saw a tall wooden structure with a rope. All I could think about was hanging and death.
Did you tell anyone about your fears?
No, I drank more alcohol. I had terrible bursts of anger. One day we went down to the basement of our home. The cat followed us and caused me to trip. I picked up a tool to strike the animal. My wife stopped me. My anger then turned to an evil madness. I pushed my wife's hand away. I drove the tool deep into her brain.
Did you tell anyone?
No, I chose to hide my wife's body. I hid it in the basement itself.
Did anyone ask about your wife?
Yes, I said she had gone on a vacation.
What did you do with the body?
I took some bricks out of the soft basement wall. I put the body in standing up. It was easy to replace the bricks and cover the wall.
Where was the cat you hated so much?
It had disappeared. I wanted to kill it, but I couldn't find the evil creature.
Did anyone find out what had happened?
Not then. The police called 4 times. The last day they arrived, they asked me to come down to the basement with them.
Were you worried?
No, I felt the hiding place was quite safe.
Did the police find any clues?
None. They were quite satisfied my wife was not there.
Did the police eventually find her body?
Well, you'll find this hard to believe. The police were about to leave. I was so confident about my success that I did a very foolish thing. I told the police that the walls of the house were very strong.
Yes?
I knocked on the bricks, right over the place where my wife was buried. At once, there was the most terrifying scream I've ever heard.
What did the police do?
They very quickly pulled the bricks out. There was my wife standing up right in front of us.
But what had made the terrible noise?
My wife's head was covered with dried blood. On her head sat a dark shape. Its screaming red mouth was open. Its single eye shined like fire. I had shut the horrible cat inside the wall.
Have you told me everything?
Yes. Thank you for listening. Tomorrow, I hang. Today, I have told an extraordinary story about a very ordinary animal. I hope you can make sense of the whole business.